Well, if there is one lesson, and there's not just one lesson, but if there were just one lesson that I've had to learn over and over and over, is just exactly how little control I have over life in general, even on a day-to-day basis, even in something as simple as being sick, and how little control. I was trying my best last week to avoid going to the emergency room for a wide variety of reasons, and I don't know anybody standing in line to go to the emergency room anyway, but I just didn't want that to happen. So my doctor's office wouldn't take me. They just, if you say the wrong words to a doctor's office, they send you to the emergency room, and so I'd made that mistake. So then my next effort to control the situation was to go to a Med Express place, right? So generally the waits aren't as long, the copay's not as high, and I thought that will be my answer. That's what we'll do. And you know, it wasn't 15 minutes after I was at the Med Express place they sent me where? The emergency room. I don't have as much control as I like to think I have. Even when I have the best laid plans, I just, you end up thinking, wow, I don't get to call as many shots as I think I get to call. And the older I get and the more experiences I have, the clearer it becomes that I just don't know how to live my life the best. That's not, I want to say that I know how to live life in and of myself, but honestly, I don't, and I learn that lesson frequently, and the greatest piece of wisdom I've come to know about me in my life is this, that Jesus does know the absolute best way for me to live this life. He literally does. He knows how to live my life, not just life in general, or not just some pious, aesthetic life, but he knows how to live my life. And if I trust him, if I really truly put confidence in him, he'll not only teach me how to live that life, but he will transform me into the kind of person who naturally lives the life that he lived. And that, in a nutshell, is the gospel that we want to proclaim. That's the gospel that we've heard and are taking in ourselves. I wondered this week, how many of us, if we were asked, would say we feel like we have life figured out? I wonder how many of us would say, well, I'm not perfect, but I think I've got life kind of figured out. And all the little sayings about that, like, oh, take one day at a time. All right, that's good advice. Or don't sweat the small stuff. You might see that on a bumper sticker or a T-shirt somewhere. Or live, laugh, and love. I like that one. That's a good summation. It's not bad. Or just be the kind of friend you want to have. I tell my kids that frequently. It's a good piece of living life advice. Or if you are a major marketer of athletic wear, you might just say, just do it, and that's the motto of life. Or pick yourself up and dust yourself off and try again, no matter what. And all the sayings, they're all aimed at kind of summing up how to do life, what's the best approach to life, perspective. And some of them have some truth, like we said, and some of them don't hold a lot of water, especially when the rubber meets the road. And it seems kind of silly to think that we can sum up an approach to life with a catchphrase. But actually, I think we can to some degree. I really do. And I think it's out there on our marquee, and I think you hear about it from us a lot when we say that we're here to do life with God in community. To do our lives literally with Him, not for Him, not trying to just perform for God, but literally do one day at a time with Him and have an awareness of His presence and an interactive relationship with Him. And we do that in a community of other people who are knowing and learning to know and follow Jesus. Wouldn't it be pretty amazing if we actually did come to the point where we really felt like, man, we do have life figured out? That'd be pretty amazing. But I don't know that we believe that we can do that, especially if we think like, well, I've got an answer for every potential problem, or I've got a solution for every dilemma that I face, and I know where to turn, and I've got all my resources, all my ducks are lined up. But all of us know we don't get to live life like that. I proved it last Wednesday when I thought I could short-circuit something that I really couldn't circumvent at all. It is possible, though, for you and I to have a sense of knowing how to live life. It's very possible. In fact, I think it's entirely possible. And James hits the answer on the head with these few short verses that were really difficult for me to work through, because here's why I think they were difficult this week, is because I think I was trying to find more in them than what was actually being said. That is, making it more complicated than it really needed to be. And if we take to heart what James says, it can set us on a path of life that really is rich and satisfying and peace-filled. All the stuff that we hope to gain through life. Here's James proclaiming the gospel in some very, very clear, concise terms. So we're going to look at today James chapter 3 and verses 13 through 18. James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. If you have your Bible, I would love for you to turn there with me and look at those passages. And we'll go through one verse at a time, thought by thought, and walk through this and see what James is proclaiming to us. Before we do that, I want to pray and ask God to lead me. God, not just me, but lead us as we encounter your word here. It's a huge temptation to approach this message, whether it's a hearer or me, the proclaimer of it, logically and with the familiarity that we're so accustomed to. But I want to ask you to interrupt our thoughts and our approaches, and that you would surprise us with insights and truths that we need desperately. Reorient us today to the gospel that's become obscured and confusing and maybe not nearly as palatable as we once thought it would be. That you would reorient us and revitalize our energy for life in your kingdom and doing life with you. And you would speak to us through the words of James in a very powerful way. God, give us clarity and understanding and a simplicity of heart that's willing to hear exactly what you have to say. And we'll love you in return. But Father, we're thankful today that we sit here already loved. So we listen with those ears. In Jesus' name, amen. James says this in chapter 3 in verse 13. He says, "Who among you is wise and understanding?" We kind of ask that question of who's got it all figured out? Who's got life, by the collar? Let him show it, he says, by his good behavior, his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. I can't tell you how many times I read that and tried to figure out what in the world is James saying. I mean, there's a lot of pretty sounding words and phrases there, and I think the question is easy enough, that who is wise among you in understanding? And then his answer to his question is, well, whoever's wise and understanding, let him show that wisdom and understanding by his good behavior, his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. People, that is, he's asking us, who truly knows and understands the ways of life and the ways of life of God? And the people that know that, he would answer and say, the people who really know the way and the life that God has for us, they don't go around, it's not something we just go around proclaiming and braggadociously asserting. He says, true wisdom, the one that has true wisdom, is one who lives this more than just talks it. That is, it's more visible than verbal, at least initially. And instead, they show this wisdom through their actions by living a life of consistent goodness. And that's really how he answers that. He says, if you want to say that you know God and understand his ways, let's not walk around just purporting that. Let's live that way. And gentleness of wisdom, the gentleness of wisdom. It's a strange phrase, right? Because we don't think of wisdom as active. We think of wisdom more as something we possess, a knowledge. But James is going to talk about this in terms of something that is very active, and so he describes it in the gentleness, and which would be another way of talking about humility. Look at verse 14, what he says. He says, but, listen to the contrast, first of all, between the first verse and the second verse. He talks about showing good behavior, his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. Then he says, but if you have jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This is like whiplash emotionally almost. It's like gentleness of wisdom and then kindness and showing good behavior and good deeds. But if you're jealous and have selfishness reigning and ruling in your heart, don't be so arrogant and lie against the truth. That is, if the real condition of your heart, not the one you would want people to think that you have by walking around telling people how much you know about God or how well you have life figured out with God, but if the real condition of our hearts is full of jealousy and selfishness, we couldn't be further from the true wisdom of God and the life he has for us, especially if we go around saying otherwise. And that's what he's talking about when he says, don't lie against the truth. That is, we can be honest. In one way, this is a pretty comforting scripture because James is actually inviting us to be very honest about the real condition of our lives. And he seems to be fearless in that and inviting us to not to feel the pressure to be or present ourselves as something or someone that we're not. And don't lie against the truth. And just as a rule, God always meets us in the reality of who we are, not in the pretense of who we want to be. He meets us in the real condition. And so this is a very big invitation that James is offering and saying, pull the curtains back, be who you really are, acknowledge that, and then we can move forward in terms of what he's going to talk about moving forward in. So if we're jealous and selfish, to say we're wisely doing life with God is absolutely absurd. But you know what? I've done that. I have absolutely done that. Where I pretended, I almost wouldn't say pretended, I would say thought I knew what life as a Christian really was. I thought I knew and I thought I had it figured out. But in the quietness of my own soul and my own life, man, if I looked inside, there wasn't gentle wisdom. There wasn't deeds done in good behavior and meekness, and there wasn't this life that he is going to contrast with, but there was much more of the selfishness and selfish ambition and what James calls jealousy, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But look at what he follows that with in verse 15. He says, this wisdom, that is the wisdom of jealousy and selfish ambition, is not that which comes down from above, from God. It's not the way in the life of God, but it's earthly, natural, and demonic. Living with a driving desire, James says, to serve and please myself, to do life that way, may have the appearance of some kind of wisdom. It's, in fact, the wisdom that the world is going to definitely assert that we should live by. Take care of you because no one else is. But when we have that kind of wisdom, it may look like some kind of wisdom, but it's definitely, James says, not the wisdom of God. And the wisdom is the way of those who don't trust God, and he describes it in pretty shocking terms, right? He actually seems like he builds up to it, but he says it's earthly. That is, it's of this world system. It's natural. It seems very logical to most, but then he slams this last word and says it's demonic. Did you know, James has said to live a self-driven life, one where jealousy rules the day. By jealousy, we just mean I wish I had what I think other people have, and I'm constantly seeking that. When we live that way, he says that is a demonic form of wisdom. It is his opposite of God. And if there's one thing James is doing, is he is putting a dividing line between two lives that there is no comparison. That is, I think it's tempting for many people, and I think James is addressing this, to think that, well, you know, I can be a Christian, believe that when I die I'm going to go to heaven, but I can live just kind of a self-directed life. I'll do the best I can. I'll try not to hurt anybody, but I want to kind of secure my own good and live that way. And that's not too bad. That's not something that should be horrible. And James is driving a wedge between that thought and then the life that God offers us, living life with him in subjection and humility to others. And the contrast couldn't be greater is what I'm saying. And James pulls no punches in terms of drawing that distinction. They're not anywhere close. The self-directed life and then the life with Jesus are not, they don't intermingle. They don't have some overlap. They don't have anything. James says there's nothing that would be in common with these two lives. Their contrast couldn't be further from the truth. You have the life with God, but you have a demonic life. And he would say to us in this, those are your choices. Now, I realize as I'm reading this, as I prepare this, we don't think this way. I don't think this way. That I think that there are a lot of times the self-directed life, the life of the wisdom that is earthly, natural, and demonic. Oh, it's demonic. We would even say that's kind of harsh. I mean, that's kind of a lot to say. Just because I'm not living life with Jesus doesn't mean I'm living a demonic life. But James wants us to see the contrast. That there's not comparison between the two. And there's only two choices. And so verse 16, he says this, just goes on to drive this point home, It says, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist. Second time he's used those two words to describe the self-directed life. He said, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder and every evil thing. Honestly, I would love it at times if James would back off a little bit and just say things a little softer. But I'm realizing, especially this week as I poured over this, that we need this. We need to hear where you're just living life the best you know how, and you're trying hard, and your standards are, I'm not hurting anybody, I try to be a nice person, I try to be good, and then to hear James say, hey, where you live like that, there's disorder and evil. Disorder and evil. Now that I find, honestly, if I'm living my self-directed life, that's going to be offensive. Because I don't want to think of my life like that, right? I just want to say, I believe, I try hard, I'm a good person, I help more than I hurt, and all of the stuff that we do to justify a self-directed life, jealousy and selfish ambition. And then James says, just hits it between the eyes and said, listen, where that exists, there's disorder. Where that exists, there's every kind of evil thing. So he says the danger of living life with an ultimate desire to please yourself, or just to avoid pain and hardship, where we just try to manage the course of life where our difficulty is at a minimum. He said that the problem with that, the danger with living that kind of life, the ultimate desire to please yourself, is that there is one sure way to never find that kind of life. One sure way to never find satisfaction, never find peace, never find contentment, never find joy, and it's in living the self-directed life. But the lie is that the self-directed life is the only way to find that. And we're going to talk about the lie in just a minute, but just mark that down. The offer seems to be from the world that if you take life and you get control of it, and you figure it out, and you manage it, and you know how to do it, then you'll have what you're really looking for. And we're all looking for the same things. We want joy, and we want peace, and we want hope, and we want contentment. We want purpose and meaning, and all of those things. And the offer of the world is it's found in a self-directed life. James says, no, it's not found in a self-directed life. You'll find disorder and every evil thing in that way of living. But in verse 17, he says this, and here's the contrast, and here's his description of the life with God. He said, the wisdom from above, the life with God, the wisdom of living life with God is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, and without hypocrisy. Let me read it again. And note the contrast between the two lives and see how they have no commonality. The wisdom from above, that is life with God, the wisdom that directs us to do life with God, is first pure, then peaceable, it's gentle, it's reasonable. It's full of mercy and good fruits, it's unwavering, and it is without hypocrisy. So living life by God's wisdom leads to a very different experience of life. A very, very different experience of life than the self-directed life. Instead of instability and evil, it is a life marked by every kind of good, James says. That sounds unbelievable to me, even as I read my own notes, that it is a life marked with every kind of good, because my frame of reference and my point of measure naturally is that every kind of good means a lack of problems and pain and suffering. And I don't know anybody who is living a life like that. I don't know anybody that has no pain and suffering, no problems, no difficulty, no challenges. And James says, but the life with God can offer something that you or I are looking for in the self-directed life. And the life with God that is offered is beautiful and marked by every kind of good. He says there's a purity and an innocence that marks this life, compared to guilt and shame. Now I wonder, if we were honest enough, we had the willingness to be that vulnerable, how many of us wrestle with guilt and shame when we lay our head down on the pillow at night? He says this life with God is marked by peace instead of conflict and strife. And I wonder how many people are dealing with conflict and strife, whether that be overt in between a relationship, but maybe it's just internal, this conflict that is inside and this strife that seems relentless. And he said there's a gentleness to this life versus a forceful imposing of your wants and desires on others. There's a gentleness that flows through life with God versus a constant need to try to manipulate circumstances and control people to get a desired outcome. I couldn't even do it with a Metacyst play. I ended up where I didn't want to go. Complained the whole time, didn't want to be there. I was anything but gentle in that moment. He said there's more than that, though. He said it's a life marked by compassionate service for others instead of a constant effort to get others to serve you. You know, one of the most miserable ways that you're going to live life is the constant thought or motive that other people exist to make you happy, to meet your needs. And it's a great way to set yourself up with frustration and resentment, because those expectations for others to meet your needs, to make you happy, and all of that will be profoundly, profoundly let down. It's a life that blesses others instead of a life that tries to get others to bless you. It's a life that lifts others up instead of arrogantly pointing to self. And it's consistently a truly good life. As the book that we read, The Good and Beautiful Life with James Bryant Smith, beautiful concept. Day in and day out, it's unwavering in its goodness. It doesn't ebb and flow with some bad. And I'm not talking about circumstances. I'm talking about that sense that life is good and right and pure and lovely. And it's not a show. It's not a show. Well, I lived a significant part of my Christian life feeling like I had to show something that was not the real condition of my life on the inside, that it had to look good. It was something on the outside. I'm not talking about how I dressed. I'm just talking about not acknowledging that inwardly there was emptiness. Inwardly there's strife and conflict. Instead of saying I'm always fine. But the life with God, he says, is without hypocrisy. There's no need for it. No need to pretend. No need to fake it, because it is beautiful, truly, inside and out. In verse 18, I don't know that I've wrestled with one verse as much as I wrestled with this one in terms of understanding and being able to communicate that to you in terms of the relationship of what everything else we've said, but it definitely fits in this segment of verses. And here's what it says. And it might not make sense to you either when we first read it, but listen closely and we'll unpack it. He said, "And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." I did everything I could do, every mental gymnastic to avoid having to deal with this verse because it was confusing. Maybe you all just get it and it makes perfect sense, but it seemed to just not fit at all. And I didn't understand his language. I didn't understand his comparisons, and it just was difficult. So let me read it one more time, and I think I can share some stuff with you that eventually, if you stare at something long enough and desperately pray to God for insight, that at times it does definitely come. And here's what it says. "The seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." Now, let's talk about the seed. He says this. At the end of all this, all we've done so far is to contrast two lives. He said the self-directed life is marked by this, and he is unashamed in not pulling any punches about the destructive, evil, demonic nature of that life. And then he said the life with God is like this, and we just went over that. And then he brings this down and said, listen, here, this is not just about the life that you get to live. When we live life with God, it has exponential impact on the world around us. So when he talks about the seed, he's talking about the gospel, the kingdom of God, the good news, the declaration of this life. And he says, and the seed whose fruit is righteousness, that is the result or the impact, the outcome of the seed of the gospel is what? It's righteousness. That is, when that seed is sown, when that life is proclaimed, when the gospel is shared, when it's lived out and proclaimed, it has a fruit that is righteousness. That is, people are brought into right relationship with God, and they can live life in his kingdom too. The declaration of the gospel has a righteous fruit to it. That is, and righteous not meaning moralistic purity or perfection. here nearly as much as it means right standing, right living with God. And he said it's sown in peace. Have you ever heard the gospel sown and it wasn't in peace? It's ironic, isn't it? That is, have you ever heard people who sounded angry about it? And they're just kind of not at peace. I've probably been one of those people, but he said when we get the gospel of the kingdom, we can sow it in peace, in rest. That is, the gospel doesn't require forceful advancement. It doesn't require manipulative efforts. It's a message that should be sown in peace because it is, after all, a kingdom of peace. And I think that one of the things that really hit me about that this week is how often we have struggled as a congregation, certainly me as a pastor, to proclaim the gospel consistently, because it has come to us in packaging that says, when I proclaim the gospel, or I share the gospel, that basically I'm telling somebody what they should believe. And it feels manipulative. It doesn't feel gentle. It feels like I'm saying I'm right and you're wrong. And it sets you up for adversity and conflict in terms of that relationship. But this gospel, the seed that is sown in peace, can be sown in peace because it doesn't require that. It requires one thing primarily, that you live in it, that you experience this gospel, that you learn to do life with Jesus. And then the proclamation of it becomes so natural, so much of a natural outflow of who we are and how we're living life, that it is peaceful. It is not an anxiety-producing experience. And he talks about, in the last words, he says, by those who make peace, those who spread this gospel are the ones who truly help peace come to pass. Not the politicians, not whoever you're going to vote for, not the leaders of world governments or anything like that. The ones who will make peace will be the ones who live in the gospel and proclaim that gospel. And there's two lives to live. There really are. And it doesn't matter if you're in second grade, first grade, kindergarten, or you've been retired for years. You get to make this choice every single day. Now here is a key. That at any given time, we do have an enemy who would love to take us out of the life with God. I'm not talking about eternal destinies here. I'm talking about the way you experience your life today and tomorrow and the next day. He would love to move us out of that. So there's one thing about this life that even though it's exceedingly better in every way than the self-directed life, it is not a life that avoids pain and hardship. We know that, acknowledge that, but what happens when we do experience that pain and hardship? Life with God, not the self-directed life, but the life with God, doesn't avoid those hardships and pain. It is, however, a life that does allow us to experience them and not be tossed around by sadness and hardship. Now, here's what we talked about this in my G2 group this morning. It was perfect. When you begin to live life with God, and you begin to experience peace, and you begin to experience joy, and all of the things that we hope for in life, understand that hardship will come. And when hardship does come, know this: that is the point at which we are going to be the most vulnerable to an enemy who would live to take us out of that life. And so here's how 1 Peter says that. He says in 1 Peter 5:8, be sober spirit, be on the alert. Why? Because your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. It's no coincidence that Peter compares Satan to a roaring lion. If you've ever watched any of those nature shows and you've seen a pride of lions or any of the predators hunt, do you know which animal they always pick? It's the one that's suffering. It's the weakest. It's the one that has hardship. It's the one that's falling behind. And I promise you that is in mind when Satan, or when Peter calls Satan forward and says, he is like that lion. And so when hardship hits you, he will advance on you, because that's when we're most vulnerable. He most often attacks when we're the most vulnerable, when life has gotten hard and we're prone to believe the lies that he tells us. Second thing I would say about that is that is how Satan does attack. It is not Satan's attack is not usually the physical hardship that we're facing. It's not usually the emotional conflict that we're having with somebody. It's not usually the outward signs of hardship. It's usually his attack has much more to do with what he's going to tell you about God in those moments, to try to get you to reinterpret his nature and who he is. And so listen to what Peter says to do when we find ourselves weak. Think of your last hardship, whatever it was. The stress of a job, or maybe financial hardship, it could have been physical, it could be anything. And in those moments, we got to tell ourselves the right stuff. And so he says in those moments in 1 Peter 5:9, resist him. That is, resist Satan. And think when you're talking about that, you're not walking around the rooms and casting out demons. You're resisting the temptation to believe the lies that he's going to purport. He says, stay firm in your faith. That is, stay solid in the truth that you know about God and what he's like. Knowing this, that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are around the world. It is a common experience for all of us to experience suffering. So we resist Satan by refusing the temptation to believe his lies. We don't have to have a hocus pocus spell. We don't have to say the right words to get him to leave us alone. We have to replace the lies and guard our minds with the truth. So maybe, and it's not even a maybe, but certainly there are people in this room today going through times right now, and you're really tempted to believe the lie that Satan tells you. The lie that maybe sounds something like this: God's not really going to come through for you. Don't get your hopes up. Or maybe the lie sounds like this: you can't trust God to do what's really best for you. That's up to you. Or maybe it sounds like this: God isn't pleased with you, so don't expect him to come help you out right now. Look at all you've done. Or you made this mess. You can't expect God to come bail you out. And you can tell yourself those lies over and over and over until you begin to believe them. And then your life begins to feel like James talked about, where there's disorder and evil, and chaos, inwardly more than outwardly even. And the closer you get believing those kinds of lies, the more you're going to feel the things James describes like that: disorder and evil. You know, we would be shocked. I am certain of this. We would be shocked if we could be honest enough and we went around the room and said, how many of you today really relate to that sense of disorder and evil, that things just do not feel right inwardly? Things just don't feel at peace inside. You didn't really want to call it evil, but it sure doesn't feel good. And it sure doesn't feel like the peace that passes understanding is guarding my heart and my mind. So when Satan is whispering to you, when I'm laying in the chair for the fourth or fifth day and I'm just feeling out of the loop, and I'm feeling like, you know, the world is passing me by, the ministry is leaving behind, and you're just, I'm letting people down, and I need to get better, and there's a temptation to believe stuff right then that says, yeah, see, no one needs you right now. You're not that important, and I'm not. I understand that, but it's this lie that says everything is moving on without you, and you're left on the sidelines. Or it could be because you've had the same problem for decades, that you think that God just doesn't care, or he would have fixed it, right? Don't buy the lie, because that's what it is. And instead, I want to challenge you with these two scriptures, and we're going to wrap this up. Jesus said this to you and to me. Well, I needed this last week. He said, come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. You take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart. Sounds a lot like James's description of life with God, doesn't it? And then he said this. Listen to this, because this is the gospel. And you will find rest for your souls. Maybe you don't want to admit that it's that deep of pain that you need rest for your soul. But if you could just be real honest between you and God, you would go there. That's exactly what I need. I am weary to the soul. Because Jesus says he can give you that rest because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Can you count on him? Will he be there even when you're not producing? Even when you feel like you've made a mess? Even when you feel like you're down for the third time and you're not getting back up? What is Jesus going to do? Is he just going to walk and say, well, we don't have time for stragglers? Or is he speaking to you when he said in the very last words in Matthew's gospel, he said, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. You don't get to be exempt from that promise. You may not sense his presence with you in the mess that you've made or the mess that happened to you, and you may feel like you're a million miles from him and like the whole world's passing you by. You may feel like you have just made a train wreck of everything you've touched. Or you just may feel empty and bored on the inside and like you're not doing what God would want you to do, or maybe you don't even know what that would be. And I want you to hear those words from Jesus because he broadcasts them without condition. And he says, I will be with you always, even to the very end of the age. So, I know of no better way to get reoriented than this. And I had so much joy sharing this with somebody this week who had come to my office. Then go back and read the Gospels. And if you feel out of kilter, and you just feel out of sync with God, and maybe even his people, and you just feel distant, or it's like something's just not right, and you don't know what the lies are, and it just feels like a big cloudy mess, I want to challenge you to go back and begin to read the Gospels with fresh eyes. And the story of Jesus has this unadulterated power to expose the lies that we may not even realize that we have bought into, and that it embeds reality. It's an inevitable result of lingering with the Gospels. Not just reading through them to get them done, but lingering over them. Linger longer with Jesus in the Gospel when life leaves you the most vulnerable to Satan's lies. It may feel like the most passive thing you could do, like you really need to just get out and fix the problem. But the problem, is more about what's going on inside, and I'm challenging you. If you're there and you're hurting and you're just lost, or you're confused, or you feel alone, or a myriad of other unpleasant ways that we experience life, then I'm going to ask you to go back and linger this week with Jesus in the Gospels. Just read through slowly, thoughtfully, reflectively. And know this as you do. Christianity is not about inviting Jesus into our lives. It is not. Christianity is about Jesus inviting us into his. And we need truth to stay there. And Jesus gives us that truth. In John 8:32, he said, you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. You'll know it, and it will set you free. Would you pray with me? Father, there really are just two lives that we get to choose from. And they really are that different. And we really are prone to get them confused even still. We really do have a tendency to think that there's some overlap. That the self-directed life isn't all bad. And I'm thankful for the fact that James just does not pull any punches there. We would be so arrogant and we would lie against the truth, he says, to think that there is some commonality, some neutral territory where they might overlap. There's not. So God, I'm asking you to give this congregation a very stark awareness of the contrast between these two lives, and to understand that we are most vulnerable today to slip back into a self-directed life when we feel pain and hardship and suffering. And that will be the moment, God. You remind us that'll be the moment that we're going to be most tempted to believe the lies about you, that our enemy is going to unceasingly whisper in our ear. And the only way that we'll stand firm in our faith and resist him is to saturate our minds with the good news of Jesus and his life and the revelation of the kind of God you are in him. And I pray you would help us to do that. I pray parents would come alongside of children, that friends would come alongside of friends, and that spouses would sit together and speak and proclaim this gospel over one another so that the life with God could be lived and relished and shared certainly, but cherished also. Father, I'm thankful that we have this. I'm thankful that it's clear. Now help us to move forward as a church in this way. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.